At first light in the Adirondacks, a black bear stood on my porch with tears in her eyes and a dying cub in her jaws. What do you do when the wild itself asks you for help? The morning began like any other, mist drifting low through the pines, the chill of late autumn gripping every breath, and a silence so pure it felt almost holy. My cabin sat alone at the edge of a forest lake, an outpost of solitude, half forgotten by time and technology. I had come here to write, to escape the noise of deadlines and headlines, to rebuild whatever part of myself the world had taken. But that morning, nature came knocking, not as serenity, but as a plea. When I opened the door, I froze. There she was, a massive black bear, her fur wet and matted with mud and sap, steam rising from her nostrils as she breathed. Her head hung low, and clamped gently in her jaws was a cub, limp as a rag doll. She was trembling, not from cold, from something deeper, for a moment. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The bear did not growl. She did not rear or charge. She only looked at me, eyes wide, dark and glistening. It wasn't an animal stare. It was a mother's. Tears ran down her muzzle, dripping onto the porch floorboards. I had seen grief before, in war zones, in hospital waiting rooms, but never like this. She took one slow step forward, the boards creaking beneath her weight, then carefully lowered the cub onto the porch. The tiny body landed softly, head lolling to one side. Then the mother backed away, sat on her haunches, and stared at me as if waiting for a verdict. My hands shook. Every instinct screamed to shut the door, grab the rifle by the kitchen wall, do anything but stay. Yet something rooted me there, something older than fear. It was the same impulse that makes a person kneel beside a wounded bird or reach out to catch a falling child. I crouched down instead. The cub was still breathing, barely. Its ribs fluttered in faint spasms beneath thin, patchy fur. Dried blood crusted around one ear, and the hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. I didn't think. I just moved. I slipped off my flannel shirt, wrapped the cub gently, and whispered words that had no language, only intent. "I'll try," I said aloud, voice trembling. "I'll try to help." Behind me, the mother didn't move. Only the mist did, curling around her like smoke from some ancient fire. Inside, the cabin became a field hospital improvised from desperation. Towels, hot water, an old heating pad, a bottle of honey from last summer's trade with a beekeeper 2 valleys over. Anything that might help. The cub lay motionless on the sofa, breath so shallow I had to lean close to feel it. Outside, through the window, the bear still waited, a dark sentinel among the pines. She didn't pace. She didn't growl. She just watched. Every time I glanced toward her, I found those eyes fixed on me, reflecting the flicker of the firelight inside. I called Rachel Kowalski, the nearest veterinarian, 30 miles of forest road away. "Rachel, I need your help," I said. "With what?" "A bear cub, injured." The mother brought it to me. Silence. Then, "You're joking." "I wish I was." Rachel's disbelief softened into quick, firm instructions. "Keep it warm, stop the bleeding, don't feed solids. Honey water if you must. And for God's sake, keep the door closed." I followed every word. I mixed honey with warm water, pried open the cub's jaw, and let a single drop touch its tongue. For a moment, nothing. Then, a flicker, a twitch, a reflex, the smallest movement, but enough to send a wave of hope through my chest. Outside, the bear lifted her head. Hours passed like minutes. The room smelled of wood smoke, wet fur, and antiseptic. The cub's breathing grew steadier, but the wound on its hind leg looked worse. Swollen, dark, angry. A bite. Rachel would later tell me, from an adult male, bears kill cubs not their own, a brutal law of the wild that forces females back into matingness. The mother must have fought him off, lost, but carried what was left of her world to my door. By afternoon, help was on the way. Rachel and Ginny, a wildlife rehabilitator who owed her life to caffeine and adrenaline. But for now, it was just me and the silence, broken only by the crack of firewood and the cub's shallow breaths. When I stepped onto the porch, the mother was still there. She had not eaten, not moved far, not abandoned hope. Her fur shimmered with frost, breath clouding in slow, rhythmic bursts. I spoke to her through the glass. "He's alive," I whispered. "He's fighting." She didn't understand my words, but perhaps she understood tone or faith. Her shoulders lowered, and she exhaled a long, weary sigh that misted in the dying light. That night, I barely slept. Every hour, I checked the cub's pulse, adjusted the heat. It opened one eye, glazed but aware. I caught my reflection there, a tired man who didn't know whether he was saving a life or postponing death. By dawn, frost feathered the window panes, and the fire had burned to embers. The cub stirred, shifting one paw. I smiled despite myself. "Good morning, Baxter," I said. The name slipped out unbidden, maybe because I needed to believe he would have one. When Rachel and Ginny arrived, the forest had turned to glass. Their boots crunched on frozen pine needles as they approached. Whispering disbelief, the bear had retreated to the trees. Watching but not intervening, Rachel knelt beside the cub, examining the wound. "It's a bite, male. He's lucky to be alive." Ginny unpacked antibiotics and gauze. "You shouldn't have taken this risk," she said softly. "But it's a miracle he made it through the night." We worked in silence, cleaning, disinfecting, stabilizing. The cub whimpered, and the mother answered from the tree line with a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the earth. When it was over, Ginny sat back on her heels. "He'll live," she said finally, "but he can't stay here when he's strong enough. He has to go back." I nodded, though the words felt like a wound of their own. That evening, the forest returned to its rhythm, the sound of wind through needles, the far-off crack of ice on the lake inside. The cabin glowed amber with lamplight. Baxter slept beneath a blanket, bandaged, warm, and breathing. Outside, the mother lingered, shadow among shadows. I watched her through the window, and she watched me back, no longer with desperation, but with something else, recognition, an understanding that we had crossed a boundary neither of us had intended, yet both had accepted, somewhere between her world and mine. Trust had found a place to stand. Days passed, then weeks. The cold grew heavier, snow gathered on the pines, and the forest seemed to tighten its grip around my little cabin. A sanctuary turned infirmary, where the line between man and nature had quietly dissolved. Baxter healed, not perfectly, but miraculously. The wound on his leg closed to a thin scar, his fur thickened, and his eyes, once glazed and distant, now shimmered with curious light. He began to wander the cabin, sniffing at books, poking his muzzle into my boots, testing his strength on the legs of the wooden chair that had become his playground. Outside, his mother still came each night. I never saw her fully, only the brief flash of eyeshine in the tree line, the fog of her breath illuminated by the moonlight. Sometimes, she would leave things on the edge of the porch, pine cones, sprigs of berries, once even a small rock polished smooth by river current tokens. Maybe, or a language older than words. Rachel warned me not to get attached. Ginny repeated it like a mantra. But how does one not? Every creature that breathes beneath your roof, that wakes to your voice and eats from your hand, becomes something more than wild, And yet, I knew, as surely as the snow fell, that he could not stay. The world beyond the cabin began to notice. Deputy Louise Gentry came by one afternoon, her truck crunching over the frost-crusted gravel. She stood at the porch, hat low, hand on her hip, words out. She said, "Wildlife Services knows you've got a cub. They'll be here in a few days to take him." My stomach dropped. What happens if they take him? They'll relocate both if they find her. Or worse, separate them. It's policy. Aiden. Policy. That word had ended more acts of mercy than cruelty ever could. That night, I didn't sleep. Baxter lay curled at the foot of the sofa, dreaming, his small body rising and falling in the rhythm of trust outside. The snow fell heavier, the kind of snow that erased tracks and gave new chances to lost things. And in that silence, I made a decision. Before dawn, I packed what I could. Blankets, the old heating cloth, a bottle of honey water, Baxter's worn tennis ball. I placed him in the crate I had lined with familiar scents, the same blanket he had nearly died on, now carrying the smell of home and survival. He didn't protest. He only looked up at me through the slats, calm and unafraid, as if he already knew where we were going. The road into the forest was narrow and wild, half buried under snow. My truck crawled between the trees, headlights cutting thin golden paths through the mist. Every bump, every turn felt like a heartbeat counting down to something sacred. When the forest opened into a clearing ringed by tall spruce, I stopped. This was where the world of men ended and the world of the wild began, a threshold made of breath and frost. I stepped out, lifted the crate, and set it on the ground. The air was alive with silence. "Here we are. Little one," I whispered. "This is where you belong." He blinked slowly, nose twitching, catching sense that memory had kept waiting for him. I unlatched the door. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then a sound, soft, rhythmic, broke the stillness. A low, guttural hum rolling through the trees. I turned toward it, and there she was, the mother bear. She stood just beyond the clearing, half shadow, half light. Her fur glistened with dew, her posture proud yet cautious. She had been waiting. Baxter hesitated, torn between instinct and imprint, between the warmth of a man-made fire and the cold eternity of his birthright. Then, with a small grunt, he stepped out. One paw sank into the snow, then another. He looked back once, straight at me, eyes deep and impossibly knowing. Then he turned toward her. She made a sound, a rumble of recognition, of home, and he answered. They met in the middle of the clearing, nose to nose. The mother lowered her head, sniffed his fur, then let out a breath so deep it seemed to shake the trees. I stood still, every part of me aching and full. For a moment, she looked back at me, that same look from the porch, but different now. Not a plea, a thank you. And then, in a gesture that no scientist could ever quantify, she dipped her head, just slightly, before turning away. Together, they vanished into the forest. The snow closed behind them like a curtain, leaving only silence. I stayed there long after the sound of their footsteps faded. The air was thick with memory, with a strange blend of loss and grace. In the clearing where they had stood, the snow glowed faintly in the dawnlight, as if the earth itself had remembered. When I finally returned home, the cabin felt unbearably empty. The towels were folded, the honey jar half full, the sofa marked by tiny claw prints. Every corner held an echo. That night, I sat by the fire and tried to write, but words felt clumsy, inadequate. How could you put into language something so quiet, so immense? In the end, I didn't write at all. I just watched the flames and listened to the sound of the wind through the pines, wondering if somewhere out there, under the same moonlight. She was listening too. Winter gave way to spring. The ice melted. The streams sang again, and the mountains smelled of new life. Then, one morning, I opened my door and saw it. On the porch, arranged in a small, careful pile, lay a handful of wild berries, bright red against the weathered wood. I stood there for a long time. Breath caught in my throat. There were no tracks in the mud, no sign of visitors. Only the gift, a message written in the oldest language of all. Each year after that, it happened again. A few berries, a pinnacone. Once, a smooth river stone placed squarely before my door. Some would call it coincidence. I knew better, because somewhere beyond the trees, a cub named Baxter had grown strong enough to climb, to hunt, to live, and a mother bear still remembered the man who had kept her child's heartbeat alive. Years later, people would ask me about the wooden bear on my shelf, carved by hand, scarred by time. I'd smile and tell them it was a souvenir from the Adirondacks. But the truth was simpler, quieter, and harder to explain. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise that compassion doesn't end where language does, that love sometimes means letting go, that the wild, in all its cruelty and beauty, had let me step across its threshold for just a moment, and in return, had changed me forever. And sometimes, when I wake in the early dawn, and the forest breathes through the open window, I swear I can still hear her, the faint rumble of a mother's voice carried on the wind, reminding me that the line between our worlds was never a line at all.